Hello, and welcome to Reading Matter, your podcast about fiction and non-fiction books. In today's episode, we continue talking about things that I feel like would be a good idea to read in winter. This episode's recommendation is Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norell by Susanna Clarke. This was actually also quite an easy choice to make when I was thinking, okay, which novels would I consider a winter read? This one just popped up right into my head. Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norell were together, published in 2004, I believe. But actually, Susanna Clarke started working on the novel 10 years before that. But looking at this brick of a novel, you can see how one could easily invest at least 10 years of her life into such an amazing and well thought through piece of work. Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norell actually even got in 2005 Hugo Award for Best Novel and was longlisted for Man Booker Prize, which is basically the biggest Anglophone literature book prize, in 2004. Luckily, in 2020, considering how hectic this year was, the good thing was another novel by Susanna Clarke came out. Her second novel is called Piranesi, and I hope to talk about it in one of the next episodes. In 2015, BBC broadcasted a 7-part adaptation of Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norell, and I would say this is one of those rare cases when screen adaptation actually is as good as the book itself is. I believe that the screenwriters did so well that when you watch the series, you actually don't feel any holes, because usually if you have such an enormous book being transferred into different medium, like for example a TV show or a film, it's hard to avoid plot holes and missing gaps like between characters and character lines and character arcs. But in the case of the BBC screen adaptation, I think it is so nicely done. The characters are cast so perfectly. I mean, BBC very rarely makes mistakes with their adaptation, I believe. At least that's my opinion. And I think actually after reading the novel, and I watched the series way after I've read the novel, and I enjoyed it just as much as reading it. Of course, the series lacks the language and playing with text and its self-referentiality and the footnotes that Susanna Clarke has, but at the same time it brings in a lot from the actors who basically made these characters come to life, literally. So I love this series, and I can only recommend watching it if you don't have a time for 500-something page novel. Actually, the length of that novel is one of the reasons why I would pick it for winter, because if you have those long winter evenings when it's dark, you don't want to go outside and would rather chill on the couch or in your reading nook with a cup of tea or chocolate and enjoy a good book that is gonna take you in its world for a very long time, then this is a novel you definitely need to read. It's a fantasy novel set in the 19th century England. It is a little bit alternative, and the only alteration is that magic has always been and is now returning to England. And it is returning in the faces of two magicians, Mr. Norell, Mr. Gilbert Norell, and Jonathan Strange, as you might have guessed, are titled characters. I absolutely relate to the character of Gilbert Norell, or Norell, if you'd like. Because he is such a hopeless book lover. He is the kind of person who could just spend his life in his library all alone and he'll be fine. So yeah, I love that guy. He is not perfect though. He has a lot of arrogance, and I mean, yeah, he definitely thinks he is smarter than everybody in the room. And at some points he maybe is right, but definitely not always. But this is why he gets Jonathan Strange to balance him off. Jonathan is younger, he's more active. He is more dashing and thoughtless and intuitive than Gilbert Norell, which leads to a lot of funny alterations between the two characters. I will not explain a lot of the events in the plot because I'm sure everybody can find a synopsis online and check it out for themselves. I'll just quickly sum up the impression of the plot is, in my case, I felt like I was reading War and Peace. That was so much more interesting because it was about magicians, but it does feature some military action. It features Jane Austen like society of ladies and gentlemen and dukes and the king. So yeah, it's definitely worth your attention if you are into a long and wordy books, as I sometimes am. I should definitely also mention generally the style of Susanna Clarke that she uses in this particular novel, because I think it's a little bit more different in her latest novel, Piranesi, which also took her quite a while to accomplish, but I would be ready to wait forever, honestly, of that kind of writing. So yeah, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norell is usually described as being a pastiche novel. So we do not just read about the English society of the 19th century, we actually read it as the novel written by somebody from the 19th century, because it's very reminiscent in its style of Charles Dickens or Jane Austen, as I have already mentioned. So yeah, it's a perfect read for winter because it, like, I don't know, for me it feels like this good old wholesome reading that we all have started with, and like the majority of people who are into reading have read Dickens or Jane Austen, Pride and Prejudice at some point, and I feel like there is an element of nostalgia in all of that. A special place in my heart is for footnotes of Susanna Clarke, because same as Leo Tolstoy in War and Peace, she was telling additional stories, telling more side events in her footnotes. So basically you would have, I don't know, 5 lines of a normal chapter on a page, and the rest of it would be just a tiny printed footnote. And I loved it. I love those footnotes that continue into the next page and the next page after that, because it definitely adds to the story itself and to the way we experience this reading. Susanna Clarke has magnificent talent when she can write with such a beautiful style, amazing plot, interesting characters, and a lot of humor that is sometimes so dry that it makes you wonder, is it actually even humor? Is that meant to be funny? But it definitely is. And the complexity of her novel is not just the fact that it is a historical fiction and a fantasy novel at the same time. So this is again this genre mix that I mentioned before that I like so much in my reading matter, that makes it so interesting. So through this alternative, in a way, fantasy world, fantasy perspective on England, we see a lot of social criticism because she's talking a lot about class. Some of the characters, like in particular Stephen Black or the vagabond magician Vinculus, they are definitely representatives of different classes. And Lady Pole, who is of high class, but at the same time she is a woman, so happens to be even physically silenced by no other than my favorite, Gilbert Norell, in order for him to gain more power and position in society, in London society. So a lot of these things make you think again back to the classical points of criticism about society and having no access to being heard and being represented for particular marginalized classes and for women in the 19th century. So this book is going to be a perfect read for you if you want to spice up your reading evenings with something heavy and long and enchanting, because I feel like words on the page of that book actually turn into sort of like vines and branches of trees that drag you into this magical world full of fairies that are not your nice kind of guys, but a lot of English folklore, and it's cold and windy as England is in the 19th century, I guess. And it's a little bit gloomy, but if you are into this kind of matter, then definitely read Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. Oh, one more tiny thing. There is also a collection of short stories that's called The Ladies of Grace Adieu, which is a collection of stories that did not make it into Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, and there is an interesting connection to my favorite, or at least one of my favorite writers, Neil Gaiman. Somewhere in the middle of writing Jonathan Strange, Susanna Clarke took a part in a writer's class where the teacher of that class, one of the teachers, he was so impressed by her short story, The Ladies of Grace Adieu, that also gave a name to the short story collection, that without Susanna knowing anything, he just passed it on to his mate, Neil Gaiman, who was already a successful fantasy writer at that time. And he was so impressed by it that I think he was actually the first person to write a review for Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. And I think you can still find it in The View from the Cheap Seats, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, definitely worth reading if Neil Gaiman especially says so. Please let me know in the comments on social media and on your podcast platforms. What do you think about this novel? Have you already read it? Would you like to pick it up for your winter read, I guess? And if not, what are your ideas of perfect winter reading? Thank you for listening, and see you next time. Bye!